sold out, even though I'm keeping strong. But can I hold out when every bit of freedom's gone? They want me rolled out, never to sing freedom song. I wanna see the sky, I wanna feel the rain, but gotta keep away from windows, that's some window pane. It's just a shame, couldn't have planned out all our dreams. Now I scream, cause there's a man in the machine, but the train is off the tracks, and damn, it's losing steam. I wanna call Christine, I haven't seen since 013. I'm missing life like 3 strikes each night. Seems like 3 nights ain't right. Can't fight, space light, hate light, wanting to be snake-like, shedding off this gray life. In the dark can't make light, but where I'm headed now is brake lights. Where I'm headed now they break lights. Counting days like brake lights, feeling weight like brake lights. Had a great life, brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Out of place like brake lights, in my face like brake lights. Counting days like brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Sit here asking, what have I done? If these strings were cut, I'd see my son. And if I could just fly from this place, then I'd hold you in my love embrace. And if I could just speak to you now, I'd renew my vow and be in the now. Looking outside my window, a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey what my Mickey keeps, dying in my kidneys weak. Silence of my risky tweets, what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace, like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace.
Yeah. Uh-oh, they're calling him a whistleblower here in the San Francisco Labor Council.
And one.
Welcome to the 17th Unity for J online vigil for WikiLeaks publisher Assange. I'm Joe Lauria, editor-in-chief of Consortium News, and I'm speaking to you today live from Sydney, Australia. Julian Assange is a wanted man because he's published classified information given to him by whistleblowers that reveal the crimes and corruption of governments around the world, not just in the US. But it is the US, the supposed beacon of freedom and democracy and spreading press freedom around the world, that wants him extradited to the US for the crime of publishing. He's interfered with the interests of some very, very powerful people in the world by revealing their machinations to the public. That's why Assange has been a refugee in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for the past 6 years, though he has not been charged with a crime by either the UK or Sweden. He knows that the second he steps back onto British territory, he will be arrested and sent to the United States, where he's unlikely to receive a fair trial and would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. These powerful interests want him to pay dearly. His case is a historic one of press freedom. The corporate media, which once profited from his work, has now abandoned Julian Assange. And those corporate interests in the media could face the same threat to their freedom to publish classified information were he to be arrested, charged, and tried. We have some very good guests here today. I want to begin by reading the headlines of the past week in relation to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. On February 9, Roger Waters, the well-known rock musician, put out a statement in support of Julian Assange. He said, quote, "What Julian Assange is, as a publisher of real news, is a real hero. What he is not is a criminal. We, the citizens of the world, have an absolute duty to protect Julian Assange from their unwarranted and illegal attacks." There was a statement of support from the San Francisco Labor Council in the United States, thought to be the first trade union in the U.S. to have put out such a statement. They said, and I'm quoting from an article from KPFA, which is the Pacifica station in the Bay Area, it's that Assange is being held a virtual prisoner at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and the U.S. government wants to arrest him if he's forced out of the embassy. In 2020, the Australian Union stood in defense of Assange against the campaign by the U.S. and other governments to threaten his arrest and prosecution. These governments have been embarrassed and exposed by the WikiLeaks and have been seeking to arrest him and remove him and WikiLeaks from continuing their work. Richard Stone, a delegate for the American Postal Workers Union in San Francisco, introduced the resolution to support Assange at the December 2018 meeting of the Labor Council, which represents over 10,000 workers in San Francisco. The resolution condemned the attacks on Assange and threats to murder him. It supported Assange and WikiLeaks for helping to expose the Panama Papers and the Podesta emails, which the resolution said, quote, "have shown the collusions between government officials, politicians, and corrupt billionaires and corporate owners." The resolution also challenged the, quote, "systemic effort by the U.S. government to harass, repress, and jail reporters and whistleblowers who expose corruption and criminal activities by government officials." There were a couple of events in the last few days that are worth mentioning. Just on the 11th of February, on the 11th of February, there was a Julian Assange debate hosted by former British MP George Galloway and an audience of experts. There's a link that we could post for that. That if you want to watch that, it's on YouTube. You could put in George Galloway and Julian Assange debate, and I'm sure you'll be able to find it. Alexander Nekrasov, Patrick Christie's, Vaughn Smith, and Ciaran O'Reilly were the guests with Galloway, who's facing his own repression of his radio station that he has, a radio show rather, on Sputnik. They're trying to shut that down. We also had an event here in Sydney, which is why I flew out here from Washington area. It was extremely well done event, planned and executed by Kathy Vaughan, from whose apartment I am now speaking in Sydney. Kathy will be joining us a little bit later. She had James Cogan of the Socialist Workers Party here in San Francisco, and he will be also a guest today on the Vigil. We spoke and we had a musical performance, and it was well attended. We also had video interviews with Tony Kevin, former Australian ambassador to Cambodia and Poland, as well as Caitlin Johnston, who's well known, of course, as a rising star in the internet, as a woman whose writings, in my opinion, are like really hits the nerves like a guttural scream of what there's so much to complain about, and she's becoming enormously popular. And her statement was an excellent one. You could check that out on the politicsinthepub.org website. It's also posted on Consortium News, where you could watch .org.au. I'm being corrected. Politicsinthepub.org.au is where you could watch that extremely good event that we held here in Sydney on Thursday evening. Coming up, there are a couple of events. On the 23rd of February, Julian Assange will have been detained without charge in the United Kingdom for 3,000 days. That's not an event, that's just a landmark date. On the 3rd and 10th of March, there are going to be 2 rallies here in Australia by the World Socialist Workers. And that will be on the 3rd here in Sydney at Martin Place, and the great John Pilger will attend. And then a week later, on the 10th of March in Melbourne at the State Library, will be another event. So anyone here in Australia who wants to chance flying in like I did, of course, welcome to join that those two rallies. There was also a supportive statement from the International Youth and Students for Social Equality. They called on the students in Australia to join the demonstrations in defense of Julian Assange on those 2 dates. Lastly, on the 19th of March, there is in London, there will be a conference called The Future of Cybersecurity Europe, and the keynote speaker is Edward Snowden. We now are joined by a couple of really excellent guests. We've got 3 people up there. We're welcoming back, and I'm asking all of you to unmute your microphones now, please. Elizabeth Voss, who has been one of the founders of this vigil with Susie Dawson, and she's really great. It's really great to have her back here. And we then are also joined from the Washington area, I think in Maryland, by Garland Nixon, who is co-host with Lee Stranahan of a program whose name I'm certainly forgetting on Sputnik Radio in Washington. And John Kiriakou also has a show with Brian Becker called Loud and Clear, and he's joining us also from Washington. So welcome to all 3 of you. Elizabeth, let me start with you. Why did it take you so long to come back here? No, seriously, we've reached a point now where the 3,000 days of detention, and one wants to be optimistic about this, but we do know, even though the judge in Alexandria, a judge well known, unfortunately, to John Kiriakou, decided that despite the inadvertent publication of 2 paragraphs from another indictment into some totally unrelated one, which clearly states that Assange has been charged, that an attempt at a petition by a group called the Committee for Press Freedom failed in that courtroom to get those charges released or unsealed, the criminal complaint or indictment to be made public, because we now know it exists, but because the government admitted, even though the government admitted that they had inadvertently published those 2 paragraphs, they are saying that that is not proof that there is such a criminal complaint. So we're at a situation now where those charges, if they exist, and I think we can conclude that, won't be released until he's arrested. So I want to know, Elizabeth, how are you holding up in terms of your feelings about optimism going forward, about if there's a way to resolve this in the way we want?
Well, I think that, well, first of all, I'm really happy to be back, and I do apologize for my long absence from these vigils, but I'm hoping that I will be back regularly from here on out. But I think that I am not qualified to really give a forecast of the situation in terms of the legal situation. I think, John Kiriakou could probably speak to the pending charges against Assange much better than I could. But I think my biggest takeaway from that development, where it was revealed that charges are pending against Julian Assange, was to differentiate, the 2016 events, the Podesta emails, the publication of the DNC emails, to differentiate that from these charges, which, as far as I understand, are more to do with the Chelsea Manning era publications by WikiLeaks and Vault 7. And that's a really, really important point, because it takes away all of this hysteria about Russiagate, this neo-McCarthyism, and trying to paint Julian Assange and WikiLeaks as agents of the Kremlin. And I think that the public has definitely not been informed of that differentiation enough at this point. So that's my biggest, takeaway from the developments we've seen in the last few months.
That's a very interesting point, and it would point to the fact that this criminal complaint may have been sealed back as far back as 2010, and that's when Assange's lawyer started first saying that they believed that this had happened in Alexandria. So once again, as you're pointing out, the collusion narrative, the Russiagate story, will not probably figure in this at all, simply because they never found any evidence. I'm sure if they did, they would be trumpeting that. And of course, we all know that Robert Mueller, the special counsel, never made any attempt to interview Julian Assange, and he knows where he is. And he cannot run away and would not run away from where he is. But they have not sent anybody to London to question him. Of course, they have surveillance there, so they know what's going on in there as well. They had no interest in questioning him. Very much like the UK blocked the Swedish prosecutors from coming to the UK, to the embassy, which they eventually did, but took years. And after that questioning, Sweden dropped its investigation. Never was an arrest. Sorry, never was a formal charge against Assange for those cases in Sweden. He was simply wanted for questioning. So they've not talked to Assange. They've not interviewed Craig Murray. They've not interviewed Kim.com, people who could have answers for them about how Russia was probably not involved, as WikiLeaks keeps saying. So yes, even though Russiagate won't figure into perhaps the this indictment or criminal complaint, it's still obviously very worrying because he would be charged for the publication of cables and other documents that revealed war crimes by the U.S. going back during the Afghan and Iraq wars. And unfortunately, the Espionage Act, as written, as on the books, does allow the government to prosecute a journalist or publisher for mere possession and dissemination. Classified information has not happened because for political reasons, but this Trump administration might indeed be the one that does it. I'm seeing Garland Nixon, and I want when I introduce all of you, then we're going to open this up to just jump in and start talking. But Garland is wearing a certain particular colored vest right now, which I have either having car trouble and how to run in, or he's trying to make some kind of political statement. So Garland, welcome to the 17th Vigil.
Thank you.
I see you back as well.
Thanks. Great to be back. Yeah, it is. I do wear this vest. I wear it every day when I do my show, and I do a show in Pacifica also, and I wear it to show solidarity with the working class, to show solidarity with the Yellow Vest movement in France and beyond. One of the things I think that's interesting about, I'm here in DC right now. My office is on K Street, like 4 to 5 blocks from the White House. So I'm sitting here right now. And, one of the things that I think is of interest here is that I'm of a mind now that I think the U.S. government would prefer to leave Julian Assange where he is and ride this thing out. The reason being, and this may sound kind of strange, but think about the difficulty they would have in prosecuting Julian Assange. If they bring him here, how can they really prosecute him in the U.S. court? It's going to be very difficult. Furthermore, their biggest enemy is that he would have the opportunity to file for discovery. He'd be able to look in the background, as we all would be able to see what's going on. It sounds like my sound is echoing. I don't know why that is. Hopefully someone else isn't on, everyone else can mute. But at any rate, so the dubious nature of these charges would clearly be revealed through discovery. And I believe that it's much as the problem that Mueller's team is having now with the charges filed against Internet Research Agency, when they face this, interrogatories, when they face discovery requests, a lot of the information that they've gotten was through the NSA, it's through wiretaps, it's through means that are certainly not constitutionally acceptable. So I think that worst case scenario for them would be to bring Julian Assange here to charge him with a crime. Think about this. If it is a legitimate trial, he might just get off. And there's a very good possibility that he would, which would be an absolute disgrace, not just for the United States, but for the Western powers that are after him. And I think if it was a fair trial, he would almost surely get off. The other thing it would do is the lackeys, the lapdogs in the US, the media, for the government and for the deep state, they would be put in a difficult position because they would be looking at a trial that also put them on trial. They would look at a trial that would put them in a position where people would look at the media and say, well, wait a minute, you know good well, if Julian Assange gets found guilty, it's going to have a significant effect on your ability to do your job as journalists. So now they're caught between a rock and a hard place. If in fact the media goes against the government, if they go against their puppet masters, as I consider them, then they're going to lose access. They go down. If they don't, and they go along with the people, the pro-Assange people, if they go along with this, even just from the perspective, forget pro-Assange or anti-Assange, if they go from the perspective of the constitutionality of the charges, they have to act on behalf, they have to move for their own defense on behalf of Assange. So my position here is, I think the government is very, very concerned about being put in a position where they would have to move on this case, and they would have to face, both the issue of the interrogatories and the from the defense, and the social issues with the media having to decide, which side of the fence they were going to be on. So I think, so what we see is this: Julian Assange creates a significant problem for the media, for the court system, for the Western governments, and I don't really think they know how to deal with it. I think as long as they can keep his mouth shut, they're happy. And if they get what it's one of those instances where, they've got a tiger by the tail. They can't let go and they can't hold on. They can't just walk away from him and let him walk away, and they can't prosecute it because he might get up. Think about that. Nobody talks about this. What happens if they prosecute him? If it's a fair trial and he gets off, they got a big problem. So that's something to me to keep an eye on here, watching whether or not they actually ever even try to prosecute him, or they try to ride it out as long as they can and hope they treat him so bad that he dies.
Well, that was a big if you just said. If he gets a fair trial. I think they want to make an example of him, not just keep him quiet. And the question of the fair trial would, and I'm going to ask John because he knows a lot about this, unfortunately, from personal experience, that there's a thing called state secrets privilege. You talked about discovery, but they can invoke that and not allow anything from the government side to be introduced into the trial and be revealed only to the judge with clearance. And she can come out and say, well, guilty, and override the jury in the sense that the jury wouldn't see the evidence that the defense would want presented because they could shut it down with the state secrets privilege. John, would you weigh in on what Garland said about that based on your experience?
Yeah, I'm gonna be respectfully disagree with my friend Garland, only because I thought that I would get a fair trial, and that's why I went as long as I did without taking a plea, because I really believed that once I got in front of a jury, they were going to see how ridiculous this was, and I was going to be acquitted. But what ended up happening, and forgive me if I've told these stories before, but I think they're important. What the government did with me, and what they will almost certainly do with Julian, is to invoke something called SIPA, the Classified Information Protection Act. That changes everything related to this trial. So what happens is that all of the attorneys on both sides will have to be granted temporary security clearances, and literally everything, every scrap of information that comes up in the case is considered to be classified, a classified document. Julian will not even allowed to be, Julian would not even be allowed to meet with his attorneys in their offices. All meetings would have to be either in the Justice Department's secure conference room, which is where I had to meet my attorneys every time, or they would build a temporary secure area called a skiff inside the courthouse, and they would bring Julian out of the holding cell, provided that he's not granted bail, and he would meet his attorneys in the courthouse. It's very, very difficult, and it's especially difficult because you're not allowed to take notes on any of these documents. They're classified, and so you can't jot something down. Your lawyers can't jot something down to jog their memories. Nothing. You walk in, they check you. You don't have anything that you're carrying in with you. And then when you come out, they check you again and make sure you don't have anything you're coming out with. That was one problem. Another problem is that there's something called a Section 6 conversation. I had never heard of this ever in my life until it was invoked in my case. I had asked for 70 documents to be declassified so that I could defend myself. And that's what I needed. I needed 70 documents. With these 70 documents, I was confident that I would be acquitted. And so we made 70 separate motions for Judge Brinkema to review each one, and we would hope declassify them. So we blocked off 2 days for these hearings. And we went into the courtroom, and the judge said, I'm going to make this easy for everybody, and I'm going to deny all 70 of these motions. And my lawyers jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. He said, my lead attorney said, it'll be impossible for us to defend him if we don't have access to any of these documents. These documents prove that this was a vindictive and selective prosecution, which was one of our contentions. The prosecutor jumped up and said, Your Honor, Section 6 conversation. I had never heard of that. As soon as those words came out of his mouth, my lawyers objected again. And their objection was overruled. And I said to one of the lawyers, what's happening? He said, just a minute, this is really important. And then he said, Your Honor, at least let counsel into the chambers. You can leave the defendant out. Let us come into chambers. And she said, motion denied. So what it meant was that the prosecutors, all 6 of them, got to go into the judge's chambers. God knows what they told her in there, because my lawyers weren't allowed in. And then they came out and she said, I am denying all 70 of these motions. And then that was it. She hit her gavel and it was the end of it. We start walking out of the courtroom. And I said to my lead attorney, what just happened in there? And he said, we just lost the case. That's what happened. I said, so now what do we do? He said, now we talk about a plea. I told him, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not taking a plea. And he turned and he said, you know what your problem is? You think this is about justice, and it's not about justice. It's about mitigating damage. And I took a plea a week later. That's what I fear is going to happen to Julian. It's not about justice. It's about mitigating damage, because once they decide they're going to get you, they're going to get you, unless you're fortunate enough to be holed up in an embassy someplace. You know, as bad as things are in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, they're not as bad as they are in ADX Marion or ADX Florence, you know? So I fear not that Julian is going to be found guilty. I think in a fair trial, he would clearly be found not guilty. He's a journalist. But it won't be a fair trial. The fix is in, especially in this district, the Eastern District of Virginia. I'll add one more thing. I hired O.J. Simpson's jury consultant. He happened to be the uncle of my best friend's wife. And so he did it pro bono. He flew up to Washington from Dallas. We got him a security clearance, and he went through thousands and thousands of pages of classified documents. Finally, when he finished, we met all the attorneys. I had 11 attorneys, plus this guy. We met to discuss strategy. And he said, listen, take the deal. If we were in any other district in America, I would tell you, let's go for it. We're going to win this thing. But the Eastern District of Virginia, you don't have a prayer. Your jury is going to be made up of people who are from or who have relatives with the CIA, the FBI, the Defense Department, Homeland Security, or intelligence community contractors. You don't stand a chance. And so that's finally what made me take the deal. Again, that's exactly what I fear is going to happen with Julian.
You didn't stand a chance also because they wouldn't let your lawyers into the court, into the judge's chambers to look at evidence. And
they could have told her anything in that meeting. They could have said that that I had, child pornography on my computer, or I beat my wife, or I have a Russian passport and I'm going to flee the country. God knows what they said to her back there. But she came out and she said, nothing doing, no defense.
I want to ask you about Brinker, but before that, I just want to tell our audience that when you talked about mitigating damage, in your case was the revelation of the truth that the United States was participating, the CIA, in particular, in torture.
Correct.
So that got out, and they want to mitigate that damage. In Julian's case, they'd want to somehow mitigate the damage that they suffered from their own actions that were revealed in absolutely vetted and correct and true documents that were leaked to WikiLeaks and then published. Correct. So they want to mitigate damage if they can, right? Yes. Sorry?
Yes. These are their crimes that Julian exposed.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And they're going to flip it around like they did with you. It was their crime of torture, which is against U.S. and international law that you exposed. And then rather than the country rallying around to prosecute the officials in favor of that, we've got one of them, responsible for it. We've got one of them running the CIA right now, Gina Haspel, and you were prosecuted, just like Chelsea Manning, who revealed video evidence of war crimes, prima facie evidence of a war crime He's the one who went to jail and was in solitary and pretty much suffered torture himself. I wanted to ask you about, before Brinkman, one question about the skiff that you, when I was talking to Tom Drake, he told me that they indeed built one of those skiffs at the Baltimore courtroom, federal courthouse in Baltimore, where he was tried or was about to be tried. Is your feeling, if it was inside the courtroom or the Justice Department, and you probably have no proof of this, that your attorney-client privilege would be violated, that they'd somehow be listening in?
Oh, absolutely.
Or
absolutely. I assumed from the very first day that that they were tracking everything we were discussing. They were looking at exactly what cables we were reading or what we were printing, or even that they were going through our files when we finally left for the day. I just assumed that they had access to everything.
Another not very discouraging fact. Now, Brinkman would most likely, in your opinion, be the judge if there were a trial of Julian Assange, correct?
Yes, it would be Brinkman. She, over the course of many years, she has reserved all national security cases for herself. One thing about Brinkman,
courtroom
too,
700. Yeah.
Brinkman really, really loves to see her name in print. It's not just national security cases. See, in most federal district courts, you're assigned a case just based on whoever's turn it is, right? They're just assigned one after the other after the other. In the Eastern District of Virginia, the judges pick and choose what cases they want to hear. And then the cases that really nobody wants, and they're usually minor cases, are generally given to the, not the administrative, but the, what do you call them? The other judges, the more junior federal judges, I forget the name. But Brinkman takes all the national security cases. She had mine. She had Jeffrey Sterling's. She had Zacharias Moussaoui. She has Ed Snowden. And now we know, thanks to this mistake that the Justice Department made, that she has Julian as well. Well, she also has another high-profile case, or had one that was high-profile until very recently. A woman bought a painting at a yard sale for $5. And it looked very much like a Monet, like an original Monet. And as it turned out, it was an original Monet, and it had been stolen from the Walker Art Museum in Baltimore in the 1950s. And it was in somebody's house for a half a century. They died, and it ended up in this yard sale, and it sold for $5. Well, the museum wanted their painting back. And this woman said, no, I bought this painting for $5 and it's going in my living room. And the museum sued her. Judge Brinkman assigned the case to herself because there was so much media interest in this long-lost masterpiece from Monet that she knew she'd be in the Post every day. And she was. She was in the Post every day that this trial went on. And then the museum got their painting back. But that's what she does. You know, she very discreetly makes sure that she stays in the news. And what better case to keep her in the news every single day than Julian Assange?
When I went to her courtroom to the argument then in whether to rule this criminal complaint, noticed that she had even violent crimes, a bunch of suits too. So she takes on all kinds of cases. That's a fascinating painting, which I'd never heard before. Now, Elizabeth, can you weigh in? I'm not opening it up, just a discussion. Yes, you want to add something?
Yeah, I want to add one more thing about Brinkman. She has this kind of a tick. It's something that she repeats over and over and over again with every defendant. When she hands down sentence, and it doesn't matter if it's a day or if it's 100 years, she says that it's fair and appropriate. And if you sit in her courtroom, you'll hear her repeat it in every single case, fair and appropriate. Well, on the day of my sentencing, I was the last person to be sentenced. So I sat there for hours waiting to be sentenced. Everybody in front of me had a federal drug case. One of them was this major trafficker from Thailand. Most of them were just guys who were smoking weed at the Iwo Jima or whatever. And then there were a couple who were undocumented. Now, if you got caught smoking weed at the Iwo Jima, she gave you a year and a day. If you were an undocumented immigrant you were going to get 3 to 5 years followed by deportation. Well, she would hand out these, what I consider to be draconian drug sentences, and children are crying and clinging at their fathers, and the wives are crying, and she's splitting up these families right there in front of you. And as they're wailing in court, she just leans forward and she says, that sentence is fair and appropriate. Well, there's nothing fair or appropriate about destroying families, deliberately destroying families, because a guy was smoking a joint. You're gonna make it so he doesn't see his children for the next 20 years. You're gonna deport him to a country that he doesn't even know anymore. But that's what Brinkema does. She's a hanging judge.
What was her fair and appropriate sentence in your, Sean?
Well, that's a good question. In my case, she deemed 10 years to be fair and appropriate, but my attorneys had negotiated something called an 11C1C plea, which meant that it was written in stone and it had been agreed to with the prosecutors, and that was for 2.5 years, 30 months. So in the sentencing phase, in the hearing, she said that she had been a judge since 1986. She had been a prosecutor before that, and she had never had an 11C1C plea. And she looked at me and she said into the microphone, I don't like it. I don't like it one bit. And if I could, I would sentence you to 10 years in prison. But she couldn't. So she accepted the 2.5, and I counted my blessings.
Did you serve the entire 2.5?
Yeah, I got no halfway house time off at all. Not 1 hour of halfway house time. I did the whole stretch. And it was because I wrote a blog from prison called Letters from Loretto. It became my second book. And I continued to expose waste, fraud, and abuse at the prison. And in the Bureau of Prisons, it enraged them. They tried repeatedly to throw me into solitary. I told them, go ahead. I said, I've been nose to nose with Al-Qaeda, with Hezbollah, with the Iranians, and I'm supposed to be afraid of your solitary in Loretto, Pennsylvania? Please. I said, give me a little bit of credit. And they would back off. They always backed off. And then one time, one of the guards mentioned to a friend of mine that the reason that they kept threatening me and then not doing anything was that I had access to the media, and they were afraid that if they sent me to solitary, that CNN would be waiting for them in the parking lot and they just wouldn't be able to answer. So it saved.
That's interesting. That leads you to the next question I want to ask you. How did your revelation of torture, when the trial went on, obviously that had to be front and center. So whether you were convicted or not, the public got to hear, I would think, if the press covered the trial fairly, that America was torturing. Now, since you served time, we don't hear about that. That's not in the public conscious. That just fades in to the normal lives that we live, just the way surveillance and all of Snowden's revelations were maybe a shock when they came out for a while. But now it's just part of the fabric of our lives in the U.S. that we're being surveilled illegally. So what lasting effect, if any, did your revelation of America torturing have? And how much do you blame the media if there hasn't been any?
Oh, I do blame the media, the mainstream media anyway. My revelations led, and these are not my words, these are John McCain's words. My revelations led to the McCain-Feinstein Amendment, which says that it bans torture. It doesn't actually ban torture. What it does is it makes all national security interrogations fall under the Army Field Manual. Okay, and the Army Field Manual is very clear about what you're allowed to do in an interrogation and what you're not allowed to do. But that's an executive document. And so if you want to bring back a torture program and do it legally, all you have to do is change the Army Field Manual. And any president can do that with the stroke of a pen. You don't need any congressional action. So I like to think that my
Don't say that, John. Trump may be listening.
Yeah.
He may not know he could do that.
You're right. So, at least we haven't had a torture program since I went public. That made it worthwhile. But you're right, Joe. The public doesn't really care. When Gina Haspel was named CIA director, the Washington Post called me and they asked me if I would write an op-ed in opposition to the nomination. I did it gladly. And they gave me 1,200 words on the front page of the Sunday opinion section, major soapbox. It led to a half a dozen death threats. It was a big mess. But I got my side of the story out. And then even Rand Paul called me and asked me to go up to his office the next day, which I did, to strategize on how to defeat this nomination. The Democrats went soft at the end, the likes of Mark Warner and Joe Manchin. They went soft and Gina Haspel became CIA director. But the story just went away. It just went away quietly. And now what pains me the most is if you look at public opinion polls, a clear majority of Americans support a torture program. After all these years, after all these revelations, after exposure of these monstrous things that were being done to human beings, a majority of Americans supports a torture program. That's the most disappointing thing to me. And I do blame the mainstream media for that, because they could have jumped on this issue and they did not.
Well, one thing you said was that this law that came out of your case banned against torture. It was already banned.
Yeah,
by the Convention Against Torture.
That's right.
Oh, UN
and not just
international treaty signed by Senate, ratified by the Senate, which automatically becomes U.S. law. So what did they ban? They banned something. It's like banning murder again. I don't get it.
Yes. Again, forgive me if I sound like a broken record, but not only are we signatories to the United Nations Convention Against Torture, we were actually the drafters, the authors of that convention. Besides that, we have a federal law in this country called the Federal Anti-Torture Act of 1946. And it specifically banned those things that we were doing to prisoners at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. In 1946, we executed Japanese soldiers who had waterboarded American POWs. That was a death penalty charge to waterboard somebody. In January 1968, the Washington Post ran a front page photograph of an American soldier waterboarding a North Vietnamese prisoner. The day that picture ran, Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense at the time, ordered an investigation. That soldier was arrested. He was charged with torture, convicted, and sentenced to 20 years at Leavenworth. Well, the law never changed over all those years. Never. So I always contended that it made no sense for something to be a crime in 1946 and a crime in 1968 and then perfectly legal in 2002. It made no sense. It was a bastardization of the law.
Without any changes, any legislation overturning it, of course.
Correct.
You said there's no torture program. Now,
well,
do you need a program to torture people?
No,
Can't you?
certainly not.
Isn't there freelance torturing going on?
Yeah, there's a lot of freelance torturing. I mean, we have no idea really what our soldiers are doing on any given day in Afghanistan or in Syria or in Yemen or Somalia or any of the other 100+ countries where they happen to be. We have no idea. You know, we get information out in drips and drabs, like this soldier in Afghanistan who was questioning an Al-Qaeda suspect, or Taliban suspect really is what he was. And then as he was taking him back out of the base to take him back to his village, saw one of the sources who was from the same village. And rather than expose the source, our soldier took his guy out and shot him in the head and buried him in a shallow grave. And is shocked. He's shocked he's been charged with murder. Well, that kind of thing happens all the time. We just never hear about it. So I would call that in part a torture program.
Wow. Let me bring in Elizabeth, who's been waiting there. Do you have, and if you unmute your microphone, thank you, Elizabeth.
Yes.
Do you have anything to add to this discussion that we're having here?
Sure. Yeah, no, I thought it was really interesting earlier when John was discussing the Eastern District Court of Virginia, the fact that again, I just want to return to the point that when people confuse that with Mueller's investigation, that's based in, I believe, Washington, D.C. So it's very, very clear from what we know that these charges against Assange have nothing to do with Mueller's investigation. I just want to reiterate that point because I think it's something that people don't know enough about. So that was one of the major thoughts I had, just reflecting on what John said. So.
Yeah.
And I think my video is frozen or something, so I apologize about that.
Well, we can hear you, and it's a nice picture of you, so we'll deal with that. John, what do you think is worse from the government's point of view, U.S. government's point of view? Your revelation of torture or the revelations of WikiLeaks? And how would Assange be treated by that judge? And depending on your answer.
I don't think that either one of them were bad. But I think Julian's revelations.
From the government's point of view.
Yeah. I think Julian's revelations were more embarrassing. And that's really the question here. We know now with hindsight that literally nothing that Julian revealed led to any kind of a long-term problem for the United States. It didn't expose sources and methods. It didn't expose, the names of confidential informants. It didn't jeopardize relationships. It exposed crimes. And there's actually a law in this country saying that it's illegal to classify a program that is a crime. You can't legally classify something just to keep yourself from being embarrassed by it. And Julian embarrassed them. So I think that his case is more important for the government than mine was. I would also say that I agree with Garland in that they don't want Julian to mount a defense. They're going to want him to take a plea and to keep his mouth shut, because God knows the damage that Julian could cause them in court. You know, my attorneys early on in my case raised something called the issue of gray mail. Not blackmail, but it's kind of gray. And what that meant is, or was, in my case, look, I was at the CIA for 15 years. Half of that was in counterterrorism operations, which is the ugliest, bloodiest part of CIA operations. Horrible things happen in counterterrorism. You see horrible things, war crimes, crimes against humanity, human rights violations, and you keep your mouth shut because it's wartime, things like that happen. You convince yourself to keep your mouth shut. Well, it's the same thing with Julian. God knows what Julian knows from all the different documents that he's seen. The government can't be confident that WikiLeaks has released literally everything. And they're going to be afraid that Julian's going to get up on the stand to defend himself, and he's going to reveal more classified information. Now, that's going to force the government to the negotiating table, because the last thing they want is Julian on the stand testifying on his own behalf.
Probably won't happen. You said that after there's no official torture program, in part because of your revelations. Mm-hmm. But so in other words, there are no black sites, perhaps, although it could still be going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I think
so you had some impact.
Yes.
You had some impact, though. In the end, you served 2.5 years in prison unjustly, but you did, in the end, do something that may have been worth it for you, because there's at least been an ending of official torture.
That's right. John McCain. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go on. No,
John McCain told the New York Times in 2015 that it was only because of my revelations that the McCain-Feinstein Amendment passed. And indeed, it took 8 years after my revelations for McCain-Feinstein to pass. But he said that had I not said anything, the American people would not have known that we were torturing prisoners. So that made it all worthwhile. You know, John McCain was wrong on 99% of his policies, but on torture, he was completely right.
Well, for obvious reasons, because if he hadn't experienced it himself, maybe he wouldn't have been.
That's right.
Now, Trump on the campaign trail and in debates in the primaries anyway said that he wanted to bring back worse than border torture.
Yeah,
waterboarding,
he said waterboarding is a hell of a lot worse.
Hell of a lot worse. Now, the guy's a big BS artist. We know that. He's always exaggerating everything. Everything's great. Everything's bigger. Everything's going to be worse. But still, you say that he has not brought back an official torture program, even with Ms. Haspel at the helm in Langley. This is quite extraordinary. But we don't really know, do we?
We don't know. She was questioned at length on this issue in her nomination hearing, her confirmation hearing before the Senate Intelligence Committee, publicly, and I would assume privately as well. And she actually made a reference to my revelations, saying that in the end, she realized, and the organization realized, that the program was probably not legal. Now, that's as good of an admission as we're going to get from bloody Gina Haspel. But but she told lawmakers, including Republicans, that there would be no torture program on her watch. That was a dark day for the agency. That the program was conceived and implemented in the ugly days post 9/11, and that it wasn't coming back. Now, we're going to have to take her word for it, I suppose, and rely on the media to make sure that she is telling the truth and continues to tell the truth. But officially, as it stands now, there are no black sites anywhere. But you know what, Joe? That's not to say you don't really need a black site in order to torture somebody. What you do is an extraordinary rendition. Now, a rendition is if I'm in Pakistan and you're an Egyptian and I catch you in Pakistan, I send you back to Egypt because you're Egyptian. That's an extraordinary rendition. I mean, that's a rendition. An extraordinary rendition is if I'm in Pakistan, you're an Egyptian, I catch you and I send you to Israel for interrogation, or Syria or Libya. And I say to those intelligence guys, don't torture him, right? And you wink, don't torture him. But whatever he says, send us a memo and let us know. Give us the transcript. That's an extraordinary rendition. Those are illegal. But the CIA has never come out to say, we don't do extraordinary renditions. They've never said that they don't do them.
And they would probably use that when they want to send to a country that does torture when a citizen's country doesn't alert. For example, an Egyptian would easily be sent back to Egypt because he's going to get tortured. But if it's an American or let's say a Frenchman, they may send him to Egypt or somewhere where he could be. Now, that leads me to my next question, actually, too. While your revelations had some effect, positive, as McCain has said and others, as you've laid out here, what about the revelations of Julian Assange, of WikiLeaks, of the war crimes committed? Would that have any impact on the U.S. no longer committing war crimes? I don't see it myself. No. What do you think?
No, I don't think so either. As terrible as that sounds, I mean, what Julian exposed, being a video, in my opinion, was so much more impactful than what I exposed, because you could see it, and then you could keep going back to it on YouTube. That you're watching a war crime unfold before your eyes. That should have led to statutory changes. It should have led to military officers going to prison. It should have led to people being reduced in rank. It should have led to policy changes. And none of those things happened. None of them. The government, through the media, was able to turn the debate to make the debate about WikiLeaks and not about the war crimes that WikiLeaks exposed.
And one could argue that war crimes are worse than torture, even of a higher order.
Mm-hmm.
And it's had no impact. And another thing that we should have seen was editorials in the New York Times and the Washington Post insisting that those people responsible, the pilots, their superiors, whoever was responsible, be prosecuted and charged. And that the U.S. never do this again. And instead, they've turned around and also made it about now Assange personally to smear him when they once profited from his work, including in those days, because it made the Bush administration look bad. This is my view. Now that he's made the Democrats, Hillary in particular, look bad, he's he's got to be attacked and smeared. And lost in all this are the war crimes that were revealed. It is just accepted now. There's been no change or any impact. At least in your case, there's been at least an official disbanding of an official program of torture, whether it carries on or not. We're in the revelations of WikiLeaks, and there were so many films and documents, but the premier one is this video you're talking about, I would think you'd have to say, that shows in action a prima facie evidence of war crime. There's been no impact at all, and the media has turned against this guy.
Yes.
Which is just unbelievable to me.
Shocking and disappointing. I agree.
I have a question on that for John, and that is, what do you were mentioning the way in which, you know, torture and that was exposed in previous decades was prosecuted. What do you think has changed the culture around that to the point where now there is no prosecution about it, and in fact you were the one that was prosecuted for revealing it? Is there any specific reason that you can think of, or multiple?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it was 9/11. 9/11 was so traumatic inside the CIA. It was such a colossal intelligence failure. Every CIA officer in that building felt at the time that he had the blood of 2,000 Americans on his hands. You know, you're paid to do one thing, and that's protect the country, and you fail utterly and completely. And then at the same time, just after 9/11, Osama bin Laden released a statement saying that Al-Qaeda was planning an attack that would dwarf 9/11. And we had to believe him. So people went completely overboard in just ignoring the law, the rule of law, human rights, civil liberties. They just did away with them. I naively believed at the time that it was a pendulum, and the pendulum would swing back in the proper direction, back toward a respect for human rights and civil liberties. And that just never happened. What happened instead was organizations like the CIA, the NSA, the FBI et al. Saw this newfound authority and said, oh, this is better than we've ever had it. We're never giving this up. And so they began doing, or CIA and NSA began doing what J. Edgar Hoover had perfected in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And that is going to Congress every year and scaring the shit out of members of Congress about threats against the country, and then demanding ridiculous increases in budgets, and then getting it. I remember going up to Cofer Black one day. Cofer became Ambassador Cofer Black, but he was the director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. And this was about 3-4 months after 9/11. And I caught him in the hall. And I said, Cofer, I just need 1 minute. I have an idea for an operation that I want to do. And he put up his hands and he said, whatever it is, just do it. I have so much money, I can't possibly spend it all. And so I did it. There was no oversight. There was no board that I had to argue before. There was no chain of command that I needed to get permissions from. I just did it. I booked myself a business class ticket and I went and did it. Just like that. And the CIA likes it when nobody's looking over their shoulders.
That's incredible.
He didn't know what it was. Huh? He did not want to know what it was. Oh, you told him what you were going to do.
No. He didn't even know it. He didn't care what it was. You know, was it to capture Arabs? Go do it. Another thing too. Do you remember the movie The Kingdom with Jamie Foxx and a couple of other big stars? Well, there's a scene. There are two scenes in that movie. One is where an FBI agent is going to go to Saudi Arabia to investigate a terrorist attack that killed his best friend. And as he's leaving, the best friend's widow whispers into his ear, kill them all. And at the end of the film, where he's found the mastermind of the attack, he shoots this guy, and the guy's granddaughter kneels down and she's crying, oh, Abba, you're shot, you're dying. And he tells her, my daughter, grow up and kill them all. And when I was leaving for Pakistan to head counterterrorism operations there, as I was leaving, the guys in my branch were shaking my hand, you know, Godspeed, good luck, be careful. And my boss leaned forward and he said, kill them all. And I remember thinking, my God, is this what we've come to? And it was. That's what we had come to.
Wow. That's quite interesting. I hope that isn't classified stuff you're telling us here, John.
Nope.
We want to keep...
It's all in book number 1.
It's not classified. They told you to kill them all is not a classified order.
Nope.
You're allowed to go and do whatever you want. Tom Drake told me a story you reminded me of. Tom Drake, of course, being the whistleblower from the NSA, who first revealed the wireless wiretapping in the Baltimore Sun. They almost put him in jail, but he stuck to his guns, and the government knew they didn't have a case, and they dropped it in the end. He told me that right after, a couple of days after 9/11, that his superior that he was working with, she was number 3 in the agency, in the NSA, went around, talked to the troops, you know, the lower level grunts working the surveillance, and to try to keep the spirits up after 9/11. And they were quite upset, as Drake was, that they'd failed the country. They took their job seriously about providing security, national security, to the American people. And they were upset that they'd failed, that they had not discovered this 9/11 plot before it happened. And she apparently said, according to Tom, this was the best thing that ever could happen to the agency. You know how much money we're going to get?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And they were shocked. And
Absolutely.
that story tells you a little bit about, in these agencies, FBI, NSA, probably it's CIA, there are lower level people who actually believe what they're supposed to be doing and want to do the job to protect the US. And inevitably, a lot higher level folks don't see it that way, and have been known to quash investigations if they're getting too close to powerful interests or whatever. And just like Sibel Edmonds' story, if you know, is that her investigation that she had started was stopped by the FBI. And I worked on that, talked to an FBI agent at his home outside Denver, and he more or less confirmed that was true, that they were shocked that they were told to stand down. So was that the same with the CIA as well? Were they idealistic agents, or is it more corrupt than the FBI than the NSA?
I found the corruption, like Tom Drake did, I found the corruption to come from the management levels at the CIA, and not the lower management. I mean, I was a branch chief, 3 times. It wasn't at my level, but it was above that, at the level of division chief or office director or the deputy directors of the CIA. It was all politics for them. They weighed everything against how it would play at the White House and how would it play on Capitol Hill. And then at the deputy director level up at the top, they kind of sort of worried about whether or not it was legal, or if we could argue successfully that it was legal, even if it was clearly illegal. You know, there are so many ways to twist words and phrases and say that up is down and night is day. And if they think that they can pull that off, they go for it. But yeah, my experience at the agency was very, very similar to Tom's experience at NSA.
Yeah, well, that's what I expected. So to sum up what we were saying, while your whistleblowing did lead to some concrete changes, you don't think that WikiLeaks, or do you think WikiLeaks revelations of war crimes and other malfeasance by the US government will lead to any kind of changes? It will just be accepted and continue as normal.
Yeah, I think that's the unfortunate case. And I think it's because Julian has been portrayed in the mainstream media, even by the recipients of his revelations, as a criminal. It's crazy the way it happened. It's crazy. He's a Russian mole. He was a Republican asset that was used to deny Hillary Clinton the presidency. You hear all kinds of stupid, crazy scenarios. But yeah, the mainstream media, I think, has forsaken him. And because of that, we won't see substantive changes. No.
So they want him more for vengeance than for anything else. They're not.
I think so.
Since they keep getting away with what he's revealing,
Yep.
You know, maybe they're not, just the embarrassment, as you said, the embarrassment more
I
than
think so. Yeah, I think
them being led to any.
yeah, he embarrassed them. And they want to make sure that nobody else ever tries that again.
They're also, as Elizabeth has been saying, they've been using him to promote and further this Russiagate story.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that it's interesting. It's not just the media; it's also entities that describe themselves as media, like unbiased arbiters of bias, like Media Bias Fact Check. These organizations will label WikiLeaks as known, associates of the Kremlin and Putin. They'll label them as providing inaccurate or mixed accuracy in their information, but then they'll, at the same time, label the Atlantic Council totally unbiased and totally reliable. So I think that there is definitely an effort to smear Julian Assange, not just in the media, but across all sorts of different organizations, so that the public doesn't trust what WikiLeaks published, for sure.
Well, that's the essence of it then, right? To question the validity of any new revelations that come out.
Definitely.
And that's disturbing. That executive order, by the way, that John referred to is 13526, and it was signed by Barack Obama, which says that the government, nobody in government can classify a document if it covers up a crime that's being committed or even embarrassment. So based on that order, Julian Assange should be able to walk out of the embassy tomorrow, because all he's done is reveal crimes and embarrassment. And that's not a crime then under Obama's executive order, because it shouldn't have been classified to begin with. So if it wasn't classified, he's not revealed classified information. I want to bring in James Cogan from here in Sydney. You're still in Sydney, right? James, can you hear me?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Yeah, I could hear you. I could hear John in Washington and Elizabeth in Arkansas better than James across the road here in Sydney. But in any case, James, tell us the audience who you are. Yeah, I was joking. I hear you very clearly. Tell me a little bit about who you are, because you're joining our vigil, I believe, for the first time. It's the very first time, and I always love seeing a new face here, bearded or otherwise, to come on and join our vigil. Tell us, the audience, who you are and how you first got involved with WikiLeaks, learned from WikiLeaks, started writing about WikiLeaks, etc. And then the events are coming up I want you to talk about as well. But tell us something about your background and your relationship with WikiLeaks.
Well, okay, I'm the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in Australia, which is the Australian section of the IC of the Fourth International. We publish the World Socialist website. We became aware of WikiLeaks, like most media organisations, in 2006, 2007. We began to follow the publication of whistleblower leaks it was making. And in 2010, again, like every media organisation in the world, we responded very, very energetically to the publication of, firstly, Collateral Murder, and then the Afghanistan logs, and then the Iraq logs, and of course the very, very highly significant diplomatic cables, which were published in November 2010. I guess if you want to say when we first began becoming involved in the defence campaign of Julian Assange, it was after the August 2010 Swedish fabrications of that Julian Assange was under suspicion of sexual assault. We were aware of the initial statement by the lead Swedish prosecutor that who overruled the initial arrest warrant and publicly stated that she did not believe there was any grounds to suspect Julian Assange of rape. We began noting that, and of course in November, when those allegations were revived by a second prosecutor, Mario Nyes, who managed through the Swedish courts. This is under conditions where we have to remember the context. This is under conditions where Julian Assange was being threatened with assassination. where the entire US establishment was up in arms over the exposure of its crimes. Under those conditions, Sweden issued a Interpol red alert, frankly unprecedented for such a matter, and arranged for Julian Assange to be arrested or detained by the British authorities. And I suppose that is when our party recognised that as a matter of principle, as a matter of fundamental democratic rights, that what was at stake was not only the freedom of Julian Assange and the rights to exist of WikiLeaks, but of all independent and critical media. The first public meeting I spoke on the question of Julian Assange, the first public meeting was on December the 21st, 2010, at a public meeting in Sydney. And since then, I have been one among a number of writers for the World Socialist website who have covered the issues of Assange and WikiLeaks. I suppose my stepped up involvement has been in the last several years, when the Australian SCP felt that under conditions where there was absolutely there was complete silence. There is complete silence in Australia, in the media, the trade unions, the parliament, the establishment, everywhere on Julian Assange. And we felt that regardless of our size and our influence, we have the responsibility to seek to provide a political direction and lead a fight to mobilise the undeniable mass popular support that exists in the working class and among young people for both independent media and specifically for Julian Assange. Does that cover what you wanted to hear? Or
pretty much.
Any questions coming from that?
Yeah, well, what are those posters behind your head, please?
The posters behind me are the advertisement that we're postering at universities across Sydney and a similar one across Melbourne for the March 3 demonstration that we have called in Sydney at Martin Place Amphitheatre at 2 p.m, which will be addressed by John Pilger as well as myself and other representatives of our youth movement and hopefully some other speakers which we're negotiating with. In Melbourne, we will be holding a demonstration on March 10th at the steps of the Melbourne or the Victorian State Library in Swanston Street. So we're currently engaged in the broadest campaign, both in the streets of Sydney and Melbourne, but above all through the World Socialist website and through social media, with the very, very welcome and generous support being provided by the broader WikiLeaks community to promote these rallies. And we have a very, very specific political demand that we are making, which I can elaborate.
Well, one would hope that you'd get a good turnout. There was a poll that was taken after Pamela Anderson appeared on the 60 Minutes program here in Australia, in which a huge number of Australian people do not believe Assange should be arrested. They basically support him. So you might have a lot to tap into there. Can you tell us a little bit about 71%? 91%, I'm being told off camera here by my expert, Kathy Bogan, whose apartment I'm in. That 91% of Australians support. How do you get 90? How do you get those kind of people out there to put pressure on the Australian government, which seems to be taking its orders from Washington on a whole host of things, including not defending their own citizen? How do you tap into that?
Well, firstly,
big question.
Okay, well, it's firstly necessary to understand why there is not a broad political movement, to put it in that sense, defending Assange. I mean, the reality was at the end of 2010, in November 2010, the editors of all of 23 major Australian newspapers and television stations issued a joint open letter to then Prime Minister, Labor Party Prime Minister Julia Gillard, denouncing her over her classification of WikiLeaks as carrying out illegal activity, declaring that WikiLeaks was part of the media and that it had to be defended as a fundamental issue of freedom of speech and the freedom of the media. At that time, the trade unions also issued statements. I mean, the media union awarded Julian Assange membership in recognition of his services to journalism. He was given an award which was presented by the leader of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. The Green Party vocally was raising that Julian Assange had to be defended. Various what we call pseudo-left groupings were organising protests and demonstrations. Now, in 2011 into 2012, and I will note also that in, I think it was February 2011, John Pilger appeared at Sydney Town Hall to an audience of about 1,500 to 2,000 people, alongside independent Member of Parliament Andrew Wilkie, at which Andrew Wilkie vowed his passionate defence of Julian Assange. Now, we have witnessed internationally a profound shift within that entire milieu. They have gone from vowing support for independent media and freedom of speech to absolute silence on Assange, combined with increasingly taking up both the identity politics inspired sexual assault nonsense, and then most sharply during 2016, when WikiLeaks did every American voter a service and exposed the reality of, and published leaks exposing the reality of the Democratic Party lead candidate Hillary Clinton. They have completely shifted into denouncing Assange. Now, so under those conditions, under conditions in which Julian Assange is never mentioned in the extent he's never mentioned in the Australian media except to vilify him. Under those conditions, it is understandable that there is not a broad popular movement. The organisations that ordinary people traditionally look to have all lined up against Assange. And so we are making very, very clear that the only basis on which a movement will be developed is one in complete opposition to and exposing the role of those organisations. We make no bones about this. We are not appealing to Labor. We are not appealing to the Greens. We are not appealing to the unions. They are the enemies of democratic rights, and it takes the specific form of their hostility to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. And so we find continually among those who were politically, not just politically, who were following events in 2010, 2011, everyone knows who WikiLeaks is. They all know who Julian Assange is. The reality, though, or the stark issue, is that we're now meeting 18-year-olds who have never heard of Julian Assange, right? And it's not because they're apathetic or because they're ignorant or because they're stupid. It's because they are so alienated. They so distrust the official media. They don't read the newspapers. They don't watch the television news. They get everything, all news they get comes from social media. And so the work that is being done via the alternate means, such as this forum, are so crucial. There is not, and so we're finding, like, for example, I just relate an anecdote. I mean, we were playing the Collateral Murder video at the University of New South Wales and other universities this week to students who had never seen it before, and they were stunned. And they immediately recognised the importance of what WikiLeaks had done. So we don't know what the attendance will be. Obviously, these rallies are being prepared under conditions of blanket censorship. most notably, I mean, we got an endorsement from Roger Waters from ex-Pink Floyd. You would think that would that would warrant at least a sentence in one newspaper or something on an Australian television station. There has been nothing. The only media outlets in the world which have reported, mainstream or official, are the state-run Sputnik News and Russia Today. It has been, and a number of South American publications which have translated it into Spanish.
Well, it's obviously Russian propaganda. So I want to first point out that that Pilger meeting in the town hall several years ago had 2,000 inside, and there were 300 people who couldn't get in. So that tells you what was going on then, as opposed to now. But you mentioned the Democratic Party and the leaks, the emails from the DNC and John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign chairperson. I mean, the Democratic Party is located in the United States. Why should that have any impact on how Australians view the work of one of their citizens? If you could help me to understand that. I do believe that it's a partisan issue in the U.S. that when he was revealing, as I said earlier, Republican crimes, the liberal media loved him. And then when he revealed corruption by the liberals, he's become this ogre and smeared. So, well, why should, that's understandable even if wrong in the U.S., but why should that be here in Australia an issue? I don't get it.
All right. Well, let's just backtrack. In November 2010, the Labor Party government responded to the exposure of the war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq by denouncing WikiLeaks for illegal activity. Right? In other words, the Australian establishment from the very outset, the major parties of the Australian establishment responded to the exposure of US war crimes by aligning with the American establishment against WikiLeaks. And you're asking why? Well, Australia is in a military strategic alliance with the United States. And it has been formally since 1951, informally since the entry of Japan into World War II. Now, the Australian ruling elite, the capitalist class, I hope you don't get offended by me using that term.
No, you're fine.
Australian capitalist class has enormous economic interests around the world. It has massive investments in the United States. It has massive strategic investment and dominance over significant areas of the South Pacific, countries such as Papua New Guinea, even into Indonesia and so on. And it views its alliance with the United States as critical to the interests of a small minority of the Australian population, that is the financial and corporate aristocracy. And above all, it views the determination of the US capitalist class to prevent China, the Chinese capitalist class, emerging as a rival to American dominance, as in its interests. So what was revealed in the diplomatic cables, for example, that WikiLeaks published, right? Among the thousands and thousands of documents were a number of cables from the embassy in Canberra, the US embassy in Canberra. And what was revealed in those cables is that the US embassy had inside at the highest levels of the Labor Party, the trade unions, and while it wasn't in the cables, we can extrapolate, in every other political, the Liberal Party, the National Party, had what it calls protected sources. Right? These are individuals who would travel to the US embassy and provide briefings on the internal discussions of the Australian government, including discussions on ousting the Prime Minister and replacing him, at the time his name was Kevin Rudd, he was by no means against the US alliance. What he was arguing was that the US should negotiate with China. And so he was ousted in June 2010 and replaced with Julia Gillard. Now, Julia Gillard was the government who denounced WikiLeaks as illegal, and the reasons why were demonstrated approximately 1 year later in November 2011, when, I don't know if you know, but Barack Obama travelled to Australia. He was given the floor of the Australian lower house of parliament, a joint sitting, and he announced what was called the pivot to Asia. That is a wholesale US military strategic economic confrontation with China, including the stationing for the first time since World War II of US Marines, US troops on Australian soil in Darwin, and the opening up, the wholesale opening up of all northern Australian air bases to US long-range nuclear-capable carrying bombers, and the wholesale opening up of Australian ports to US warships, and a discussion which is still going on about converting Stirling, that's a naval base in the city, near the city of Perth in Western Australia, to host US aircraft carriers. I mean, so to answer your question, the reason for the hostility of the Australian establishment to WikiLeaks is the US alliance. They are, and their hostility to, it doesn't matter whether the US is headed by the Republicans or the Democrats. The Australian government, the Australian establishment, recognises that there's not a dime worth of difference between the two. They both represent American big business interests, American imperialist interests. Yes, there are nuances between them, but the transition in this country between a love fest for Barack Obama to collaborating openly with the Trump administration was seamless.
I want to bring in Kathy Vaughan in a second to continue the discussion. Kathy's sitting right next to me here, but you said in 2010 that the Australian government condemned WikiLeaks for revealing that war crimes video and other documents and from WikiLeaks. But did the Australian media, the corporate media, the big media here, did they publish that information, and did they also condemn Assange, or were they just giving the facts to the public? And I'm even including the Murdoch media.
No. At the time, I mean, like every official media publication in the world, the mainstream media in Australia published virtually everything that WikiLeaks exposed. I mean, this is a fundamental legal point. If you want to prosecute WikiLeaks, you have to prosecute the New York Times, the Washington Post, and in Australia, the Sydney Morning Herald was one of its listed collaborators. The Sydney Morning Herald was actually used by WikiLeaks, actually gave to the Sydney Morning Herald the Australian-related diplomatic cables. They were, above all, published through the media. And as I said, I mean, in late 2010, the position elaborated by the editors of all Australian newspapers and television stations was that, and I'm quoting them, WikiLeaks is part of the media and had to be defended. Now, but there was a definite shift in that the government was hostile from the outset. The media was, I think, as John Pilger has pointed out about in relationship to the sordid role of the Guardian, they profited from what WikiLeaks had done, right? But after the events in Tunisia, which was called the first WikiLeaks revolution, there was a marked shift internationally, including in this country. All of the official media recognised the danger of telling people the truth. It was one thing to expose the crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was quite another to publish the diplomatic cables, which revealed that every day, in the background, behind the scenes, behind the backs of the population, what goes on is sordid intrigue between American officials and governments and corporations in every country. And in Tunisia, that sparked mass. A man was so outraged by what WikiLeaks had revealed, and so bereft of perspective, and so derived of any thought of how he could change the situation, that he set himself on fire. A young, unemployed, 26-year-old Tunisian worker. And that provoked a revolution. It's not the cause of the revolution, but it was a trigger. right? And that was then followed by what you would have to argue was the greatest upsurge of the international working class since Tiananmen Square in China. That is the events in Egypt in February 2011. Now, all those who defend the powers that be, and above all those who defend the right of the top 10%, the top 1%, the top 0.1%, 0.01% to monopolize the world's wealth, the capitalist class, all of those who defend that system responded it was almost like they didn't even need to discuss it. It was like an unconscious mutual agreement. Abandon WikiLeaks, crack down on it, destroy it. They were not going to allow the WikiLeaks model to extend and develop around the world. That is, media independent of massive corporations such as News Limited, or media independent of the state-controlled agencies such as the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the British BBC, and so on. I mean, we're talking about class issues here. Go on, sorry.
And yet the capitalist class, which I don't mind using myself, owned the major newspapers in 2010 when they decided to publish WikiLeaks. So was there a rebellion in the editors' suites against their owners, in your view? And that suddenly they fell in line when they saw the social upheaval that WikiLeaks could cause in the Middle East?
Well, I think what they recognized was that, look, initially, what was the initial revelations on Afghanistan and Iraq related to events that had taken place in the past. Right, and they could all be blamed on George Bush, Dick Cheney, and so on. What was revealed in the diplomatic cables was an ongoing, enduring, constant process. Right. In other words, what the diplomatic cables exposed was that Afghanistan and Iraq were not aberrations. They were not accidents. They were not the product of the mindset of a group of right-wing neocons in the Bush administration. They were the outcome of the day-to-day policies of American imperialism, and that they were continuing unchanged under the candidate for hope and change, Barack Obama. And what was exposed in Tunisia and Egypt, or what was revealed, in Tunisia and Egypt, was that masses of people will not accept that world. They will rise up against it. If they know the truth, if they have information, and if they have a political perspective, they will fight. And once the masses enter into the political situation, the whole equation changes. And so, again, I don't even believe it was a conscious decision. I don't believe there was a sort of a Skype call among the top executives of every media organization in the world. I believe they just simply drew conclusions based on the class interests that in the final analysis they defend. Right? It's one thing to expose the criminality and corruption of a particular government. It's another thing to call into question the very fabric of the system in which those governments operate. And so, look, after the Egyptian events, I mean, I've made a habit since about August 2010 of keeping a chronology. Every week I just update what's happened with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And you can trace the shift. I mean, it's a profound shift, and it took time, but it filtered through to everything. I mean, the trade unions around the world, the pseudo-left organizations around the world. I mean, if I had in front of me, I could send you now tweets sent by Jeremy Corbyn relating to Julian Assange as recently as 2012. Now, he's the leader of the British Labour Party. He's under ferocious attack for being fraudulent attack for being an anti-Semite. I mean, he's being denounced as a communist and a Russian agent, and he won't say one word in defense of a persecuted journalist down the road at the Ecuadorian embassy. Why? Because in the final analysis, Jeremy Corbyn, like the Australian establishment, won't question its allegiance and alliance with the United States because it views it as in the interests of the British capitalist class.
Very good, very good. I'm going to ask you.
Doubts. I'm sure there are people in the Australian Parliament who have doubts, but they won't raise them. Sorry.
Yeah, that was a good point. That by 2010, the Iraq War had been clearly shown to be a disaster. So, you revealing the information, but was already historic at that point, would not have been the same kind of problem. I'm going to bring in Kathy Vogel. I see that Elizabeth patiently there has been writing things. I want you to ask James questions after Kathy weighs in, if you don't mind holding on. And James, I hope you can stay with us for both of these excellent panelists who are going to ask you now. So I'm passing the mic over to Kathy.
So I should mute? I'll just mute.
No, you stay on, James.
Okay, sure.
Please. He's going to take a break. James, you know, with you, I'd rather listen. I'd rather listen than even ask more questions. But, you know, you triggered my memory a couple of times. And that day that Barack Obama came to meet with Julia Gillard, we had a look. I don't even know if we should say it on air. Okay. Barack and Obama sitting in a tree, Killing. But that was really interesting, you know, because why was I there? Why was I there in Canberra that day when those two signed the Australia-America military alliance? Because Christine Assange was there too. She went to Canberra on that day and I followed her. And that was the day that I met Christine Assange. And really, essentially, that was kind of the day that this massive WikiLeaks movement began in Australia, because Christine rallied so many people with the words that she said. And of course, you know, there were a lot of other people, really good people who were there, stop the war people. But there was a light of hope that started on that day, even though it was a very dark day, and so many of those things that you say were triggered by that started there as well. There was that light that of hope, where lots of people came and started becoming more active in terms of WikiLeaks, and Christine was a big influence there. And I think, you know, you were talking about what people couldn't take. And if memory serves, I think it was Mubarak's wife who had skipped the country with 90% of the country's wealth. Is that right? Am I? Tunisia. It was Ben Ali's wife. We fact check each other in the background. Yes, but the other thing is, I would really like to thank you for coming along to the event that I organised last night. It was an honour to have you. And you know, the crowd really appreciated your passion and your knowledge, and I thought really overall it was you made a great contribution. I am very, very tired now. The only thing that I've been a little bit concerned about this week is the quite large incidence of people talking about rape charges. The rape charges were dropped, and you know, you remember that moment that we had the hecklers saying there were no charges, and you see, that's this thing. There's always this permanent threat, a delay of process. Oh, it's just 5 years of waiting for preliminary questioning in relation to this. But meanwhile, Crown Prosecution Service are advising Marianne Nye on the QT not to drop the case in 2013 when Sweden wanted to drop it, and not to come there. And I don't know if you heard Justice Stefan Lindskog, who was Sweden's Chief Justice when he came to Sweden, but he did a talk at Adelaide University. And it was during, I spoke about this last time, so the Vigilists have heard it, because it was quite a smutty talk, about condoms, everything to do with condoms. But, he let it slip in the Q&A that there was absolutely no legal reason for Sweden not to go question Julian in London. And, the last time I spoke to Christine Assange, well, I think it was the time before, because it was the interview, not the emergency statement. But, she did remind us of the NDAA, where Julian could be kept indefinitely. NDAA 31st of December 2012. So this permitted indefinite detention without trial. And Christine seemed to be of the opinion that, it's not that simple. Maybe there were John Kiriakus in front of Judge Leonie Brinkema before, but how many foreign journalists have there been? This has got to, it's not just a challenge to the First Amendment. That is, Christine seems to think they're not nobody's really going to want to take that one on. But you've got, coupled with that, there's also this shocking precedent of threatening a foreign national, a foreign journalist, and therefore putting every journalist in the world at risk, not just American ones. So what do you think about that? Is it likely that all these things are delayed threats to keep him in there, but just to keep him in there and keep it going forever? But then if, they've got their plan B, their NDAA. I mean, there seems to me to be a lot of playing with the law. There was a temporary surrender treaty in Sweden. So if he actually did come, he could be loaned. There's the automatic extradition, asymmetric extradition conditions between UK and US. So US don't need a prima facie case. They can just get him, and then they can just put him in somewhere like Guantanamo. But in terms of actually facing it themselves and challenging their own First Amendment, that very well might never happen, because there are laws in place whereby that would actually be a possibility, the indefinite non-decision on that one. But just what the real point is to silence him, right? And that's been effective for some time.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, can hear you.
All right, well, I think we just need to be very blunt. The allegations of suspicion of rape were a fabrication. They were a frame-up. It was a honey trap. I don't know how it was organised, but there is ample evidence that it was manufactured in the headquarters of Swedish prosecutors and by Swedish police. As if people don't know, a complaint was made which did not involve any allegation of sexual assault. Right, that was immediately manufactured by Swedish police into an accusation of suspicion of sexual assault, and immediately leaked to one of the major Swedish daily newspapers. And so the world media was dominated the next day with headlines, "Julian Assange is a rapist." This is under conditions in which he is publishing the Iraq war logs. I believe it was the Iraq war logs. Correct me if maybe it was the Afghanistan logs, but certainly Sweden, a close, intimate ally of US imperialism, was the Swedish legal system was used to fabricate allegations to seek to get him extradited to a country where if you read up about the Swedish legal system, someone who is accused of a sexual crime is detained while awaiting pre-trial. In other words, if he had been extradited to Sweden, he would have been put in a prison cell while the US set in motion its extradition application, which we know was well underway we certainly informal or unofficial sources at least were finalised by a secret grand jury in Virginia, probably around November 2010. So the whole purpose of the fabricated, and that's what I mean. We just have to be blunt. These were fake charges, right? They weren't even charges, fake allegations. And Julian Assange was hounded, vilified, ultimately arrested or detained in Britain, forced to go through 18 months of protracted legal struggles. Full credit to his legal team, people such as Jennifer Robinson. They fought, but in the end, the British courts, in a gross act of injustice, upheld an extradition warrant to Sweden. Now, that is the only reason why Julian Assange was forced, and he was forced because he was given no support by his own government in Australia. He was forced to seek political asylum with a small Ecuadorian country, a small country in South America, Ecuador. He managed to get into the Ecuadorian embassy, and then he was denied his fundamental right to even leave Britain. So
I just want to interject, James, and ask,
yeah, sure,
and say some, just praise your work, not only with the Socialist Equality Party in Australia, but also with the World Socialist website, because as an independent journalist myself, whenever I have tried to cover anything related to Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, the history associated with them, I have found the World Socialist website to be one of the best, absolute best sources in terms of the breadth of your coverage, the detail you provide. You're one of the very few outlets that will actually cover this accurately and well. And so I just wanted to say thank you as a journalist, and I hope that the viewers of this stream will also visit your website and look at the articles that you all have written, because they are really valuable. So thank you.
Thank you for that. And I agree. I think the World Socialist website is an invaluable source. I personally don't take any credit for that. It's a coordinated effort across the world by the Trotskyist movement. It was a decision we took in 1998 to establish a unified international media platform, and we pride ourselves on seeking to provide objective, honest, but class partisan coverage. The media, the official media, is not objective. It's objective it is motivated in the final analysis by class interests. So are we, but we're motivated by the class interests of the working class. So,
could I just interject as well here? I also am a great fan of the World Socialist website. It's just amazing how well written it is, how well informed it is, how much information there is. I mean, things, I follow things pretty closely, and then I'm always finding out new things. I thought, wow, I didn't know about that, and I find it on the website. What I'm puzzled about is, how do you keep it going? I mean, how do you manage to just keep such an enterprise going for so long? I mean, and quite a very polished enterprise. I'm just amazed that you were able to pull this off.
Well, we do it on the basis, firstly, of a common political program, a commitment to a common political perspective, that is socialism. We do it by a great deal of hard work and sacrifice, and we do it through a great deal of financial sacrifice from our supporters. So we don't receive, obviously, any corporate support. We certainly receive no support from any foreign government. And so, obviously, you can certainly contribute to the WSWS financially. But I think the other main thing that we all need to we do need to discuss is that, the great issue that's confronting the World Socialist website and most independent and critical left-wing, anti-war, anti-imperialist media is flagrant censorship. The defense campaign of Julian Assange is part of a broader struggle by the World Socialist website against internet censorship. If you follow the site, I suspect you're aware that we have been conducting and exposing the fact that the changes to Google algorithms has resulted in a very substantial drop in our readership. And likewise for example, Joe's website, Consortium News, for WikiLeaks itself, for a whole range of left-wing, anti-war, anti-imperialist sites. So the issue of defending an independent and critical media is one that we all need to, all those who fight for that concept, for the right to be an independent, critical journalist and actually publish the truth, we do need to form a coalition to fight censorship. And we can't do it by ourselves, one by one. You know, so we did make an appeal in February 2017 for such a coalition, and those of you who are listening online who are involved in independent media, I would encourage you to consider the statement that the World Socialist website editorial board issued, because the ability of the World Socialist website to reach its audience, such as yourself, and I agree. I mean, each day I read the World Socialist website and learn, for example, about a mass strike taking place on the Mexican border with the United States by tens of thousands of auto and auto parts Mexican workers calling for support from their American brothers. While in Washington, they're preoccupied with building a wall to separate the American and Mexican working class. You know, there are fundamental issues underway. We live in days where the working class is resurgent. I think you'll get a sense from the World Socialist website of that. I mean, each day now we're reporting on growing strike movements and protest movements by the working class around the world, and that's what has to be developed into a conscious political movement for change. And it's also the great social force, the great social movement that can bring about the freedom of Julian Assange and other persecuted journalists, dissidents, whistleblowers, and so on.
Right. But you were talking about Jeremy Corbyn. So you really basically think that he's somebody who's never going to fight for the working class, that he's just a sellout to corporate interests? Or do you have some hope for Corbyn?
No, I have no hope for Corbyn.
Okay.
Jeremy Corbyn is what he is. Jeremy Corbyn is a lifelong member of the British Labour Party, one of the key pillars of the British state. He served a purpose as a sort of a left voice of dissent for decades. At a certain point, they needed, in order to revive the fortunes of the Labour Party, they needed a figure like Corbyn, and he was elevated into the leadership with and considerable. Look, ordinary people don't understand all the histories of things. They took Corbyn at his word. When Corbyn said he was a socialist, that he wanted, he was going to defend the National Health Service, that he was going to repudiate the Trident submarine program, that he was going to, he was going to take a stand against war, they believed him. Now, the record is that since becoming Labour leader, he has continually accommodated himself to the Blairite right-wing wing of the British Labour Party. And I mean, it's not just a question that he's impotent. I mean, he's collaborating with them. I mean, they're actually now, our party in Britain, the Socialist Equality Party in Britain, commented recently on the phenomena where you had a Labour Party branch move to expel one of the Blairites from the branch, and they intervened and expelled the people who had actually organised the expulsion. And Corbyn said nothing. I mean, he's sitting there, they're denouncing him as an anti-Semite, and he won't fight to defend himself.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I'm amazed by his reluctance to put up a fight. I mean, to really, it's such a dishonest campaign. As was the campaign that he was some kind of a Putin's agent. All these are such utterly, flagrantly dishonest campaign, and he seems so inept at defending himself. I mean, it's just, he's actually defending himself, and he seems inept at doing it.
Yeah, but he won't. To defend himself would mean fighting the British state, and he's not going to do that. He's not going to fight British capitalism. The Labour Party never has. His actual political role is to defend it. I mean, it's like
very
Syriza.
similar to the situation in the US.
Sorry?
No, I was going to say that it's very similar to the situation in the US. And,
Yes.
you know, not to spout my own political beliefs, but when I see somebody like Bernie Sanders towing the Russiagate narrative rather than even defending himself or defending his followers who were cheated in the Democratic primary, that can be very frustrating too. So I think that phenomena is one that is definitely going on in a lot of Western countries, for sure.
Well, I think, and I think the stage we're at internationally is it's really crucial that all those who consider themselves progressive, in defense of democratic rights, all those who consider themselves anti-war, who oppose above all social inequality, it is time that conclusions be drawn from immense political experiences. You are not going to change the situation through Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, Cortez, you know, the new faces of the Democratic Party, you know, who also won't say a word about Julian Assange or any other principled issue.
Or Venezuela.
You know,
I mean,
of course.
She said nothing about Venezuela.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's time that conclusions are drawn in America, in Britain, in Germany, in France, or every country, as to the role in Greece, about Syriza, about what these organisations are. Spain with Podemos, they do not represent any genuine alternative. They actually are a safety valve for the establishment, while behind the scenes, we all know what's being prepared. They're preparing a police state. You know, the attack on WikiLeaks is inseparable from the growth of the apparatus of a police state. The reason they, above all, why they hate Julian Assange isn't so much. It's even greater now. I mean, the Vault 7 leaks provoked, you know, blind fury in the American state apparatus. I mean, remember, I mean, that was when Pompeo came out and said, from now on, we're going to treat them as a non-state hostile intelligence service. Because they published leaks exposing the fact that the CIA is the greatest purveyor of malware, the greatest purveyor of intrusive software, that it takes over Samsung television sets, that it tried to develop software to take over motor vehicles, control systems. And, you know, so it's a, you know,
and of course it undermined right away.
Sorry.
I was just going to say the Vault 7, of course, undermined right away the central Russia Gate narrative, which is that the Russians passed on the stolen emails to WikiLeaks, who published it at the behest of the Russians. Well, Vault 7 said, no, the easiest thing in the world is to fake the identity of the hacker. So it was the easiest thing to do was to fake that it was the Russians. I mean, so Vault 7 kind of undermined it right away, and yet, you know, it quickly disappeared from the media horizon because it wasn't the favored narrative that WikiLeaks was serving as the tool of Russian intelligence.
Can I just make a point on that? I believe there are sufficient grounds to be deeply suspicious of the identity of Guccifer 2.
Yes,
absolutely. I've reported on that a lot. We've dismantled the persona. Yeah, no,
it's been very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was common by the time Guccifer 2 surfaced. It was common knowledge that Podesta and the DNC servers had been compromised, and I suspect they also knew that there were insiders in the Democratic Party who were leaking information. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, you get the most amateurish, unprofessional, stupid hacker emerge, you know, talking about how he was sending information to WikiLeaks.
Right.
And there's not even any evidence that the DNC was hacked in the first place, too. If we, you know, going back from even the idea of malware, I mean, there's literally no evidence that a breach of that kind even took place. So it's all ridiculous when it comes to Guccifer 2.
I think they announced, I think it was in April 2017, that they suspect that they believe that their servers had been compromised, which may well, just as you are pointing to, may well have just been the sort of the story to, they knew that the insiders, that there was a rebellion going on within their own organisation over the treatment of Bernie Sanders by the pro-Clinton wing.
Yeah, it was April 16th that they first came up with that story that we'd been hacked by the Russians.
Yes.
And then and then the CIA and everything backed them up a few months later. Yeah. We agree. It was all the Russians.
Yeah. And then
And actually, I believe. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, just conveniently, Guccifer 2 manages to insert Russian language coding into his source code.
But yeah,
Sorry,
no, I was just going to add that I believe it was yesterday that Bill Binney and another author who his name is escaping me at this moment, but they published an article yesterday that again completely dismantled the entire Guccifer 2 persona, the timeline by CrowdStrike, and went at it from a perspective that kind of created this coherent narrative, including all of the different points that really have not been put into one place before about the reasons that Guccifer 2, there's no evidence that it was a hack. And in addition to that there is no evidence that the emails published by WikiLeaks were the result of a hack. So the kind of two separate subjects. That article is really great. And if the listeners haven't read that yet, you really should, because it's a fantastic article. I just wanted to throw that into the discussion.
Yeah, where can we find this article?
I will post it into the live stream comments. 1 second.
Oh, I see you're back,
It
Joe.
was published.
Don't mind the man behind the curtain. Just carry on. Don't mind me, please. You've just proven how expendable I am. I think you guys carried on very well without me. Thank you.
The other author was Larry Johnson. I'm so sorry that I forgot his name for a moment. And it was published on turcopolier.com.typepad.com.
What is it? What's that?
It's the website that it was published on is turcopolier at .typepad.com. I've put the link into the live stream chat on the Vigil, so people can take a look.
But Joe, do you mind if I just come back to the demonstrations that we're calling and perhaps give listeners sort of an explanation of what their motives are?
You don't need my permission. Just because
Right.
I got the headset back on. Please go ahead.
Well, the demonstrations are making a demand on the Australian government. That is that the Australian government does have the diplomatic power. It does have what is correctly defined as the legal discretion, that is the legal choice, to intervene, to secure or to essentially compel the British government to drop the bail charges, the bail-related charge, which is the only revealed criminal charge against Julian Assange. They do have the power to compel Britain to drop that charge so he can walk out of the Ecuadorian embassy, and if he wants to do so, return to Australia, providing the Australian government has given a guarantee that he will not be extradited from Australia to the United States, though the legal opinion that we have received last year makes there would be a very powerful case which would be conducted in the Australian courts to defeat any US extradition warrant on the grounds that it's a violation of international law and a violation of Australian law. So we think under the conditions, current conditions, that given that Julian is an Australian citizen, that the pressure that we exert in this country is absolutely crucial to the international fight for his freedom, right? I mean, obviously we completely support and solidarize ourselves with the protest actions and all the actions being taken by defenders of WikiLeaks around the world. But specifically, the Australian government does have the ability to place immense diplomatic pressure upon the government of Great Britain.
I just want to point out that he's not been charged with skipping bail. There's simply an arrest warrant. If they arrested him, they could charge him with that, or they could just shuffle him off to Heathrow and onto a plane back to the U.S. Elizabeth, if you could unmute yourself, because just to follow up on what James was saying, you are also an Australian citizen and you're living in the U.S. quite some time, so you have both perspectives. Could you follow up on any of this, what he was saying about either the importance of Australians coming out or the issue of extradition?
Sure. Yeah. To clarify, I'm a dual citizen of both the US and Australia.
Even better.
Yeah. Funnily enough, I grew up in Australia. I've lived in the US now for over 10 years. So I definitely do have a perspective on kind of the cultural attitudes in both places, which is something I haven't written about, but it is something that I keep in mind when I'm writing. I think that it is really saddening to hear that there is so little awareness on the ground in Australia about Julian Assange. I think that's a really serious problem. I agree with what James has been saying about that. I can say that in the US, there is equally, if not more, ignorance about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, even amongst people who, consider themselves to be progressive or liberal. They have really fallen, unfortunately, for all of this propaganda about WikiLeaks being a tool of the Kremlin, despite there being no evidence for that accusation whatsoever. And so I think that, unfortunately, it's depressing to say this, but I think that what James has been saying does unfortunately apply to the US equally. And it's definitely culturally interesting, though, to witness the way in which Australia and Australian culture, which kind of prides itself, in my opinion, on being going against the grain. And there was a lot of criticism in Australia on the ground for the second war in Iraq leading up to that. It's really depressing for me to hear that in Australia, that same culture is not doing that, is not following through in standing up for Julian Assange, that they aren't kind of bucking the establishment when it comes to his case for WikiLeaks. I think that's really sad. So,
can I just make a point? Sorry, just Joe. The point, what Elizabeth just raised is an important issue about the Iraq war protests in 2002 and 2003. The demonstrations in cities such as Melbourne and Sydney were among the largest in the world. I mean, I was at obviously the one in Sydney. I mean, by some credible estimates, there were up to 400 to 500,000 people there. That is about one in every 8 citizens of Sydney. Now, what has to be, rather than getting depressed about it, we have to remember that the organisations that led that anti-war movement, the trade unions, the Greens, a number of other organisations. In fact, the main speaker in Sydney was John Pilger. Now, apart from figures like John Pilger, those organisations have thoroughly shifted to the right. In the wake of the financial crisis in 2008, the greatest shock to world capitalism really since the Depression, in the wake of the eruption of international class struggle, above all in Egypt, all of these organisations, which, while yes, they were opposed to certain aspects of what US imperialism was doing, they do not oppose capitalism. And they have all lurched to the right. I mean, I think there are many, many people who are part of the WikiLeaks defence movement and part of the broader campaigns and issues to defend refugees, to defend immigrant rights, against the growth of neo-fascism and so on, that they're not actually conscious that they're actually reflecting broad anti-capitalist sentiment. And that has to be translated into conscious anti-capitalist sentiment. Now, I'm not trying to issue a political treatise, but you are not going to overcome what you referred to as the ignorance and so on among ordinary people, except through the most determined fight to build a new political movement. You're not going to reform the Democratic Party in America. You're not going to reform the Labor Party. You're not going to turn the Green Party in Australia back from a sordid identity politics riddled, bankrupt organisation into some type of movement fighting for genuine change. We have to develop a movement.
Could not agree more.
Yeah, we have to develop a movement
in
the working class, and the most important developments in the United States are is the struggle by the Socialist Equality Party and a growing layer of workers to organise new independent organisations. We held a demonstration in Detroit. It wasn't a huge demonstration, but it was historically significant. On February 9th in Detroit, workers gathered completely independent of the unions and demanded a fight to defend thousands of working class jobs which are being destroyed in Hamtramck, in Ontario, in Canada. They called for unity with workers in Mexico. Now that's the way forward. The way forward is through the independent mobilisation of the working class, and I actually believe that the movement that has developed, and it's been done through Unity for J, through many other mechanisms, but the movement developing around Julian Assange, is an important contribution to a broader political radicalisation in the working class. And, we can't, what am I trying to sort of convey? The massive social change begins among a conscious, politically determined, politically directed minority. And that's what I believe we're seeking to forge.
Well, James, at the beginning of the vigil, I read out a statement that the San Francisco Labor Council, spurred on by American Postal Workers Union member, actually got a resolution passed. Labor Council being a conglomeration of various unions in San Francisco in the Bay Area, supporting Julian Assange and asking that he be free and condemning any attempts to extradite him. How significant you think that might be in terms of, I know how you feel about the established unions. Is that a significant thing? And could that happen when did that happen? On Wednesday, I believe, this week. And could that happen here in Australia, in your opinion? And if not, what does that say about the US and Australia?
Look, I don't discount that as a result of of course we don't discount that what we're doing independently of all these organisations will result in figures within those organisations actually shifting their position. It would not shock me in the slightest, for example, if as a result of the work that we're doing with the support of figures such as John Pilger, to call these demonstrations, if there is a shift in the attitude of members of parliament, if voices do start to get raised. I mean, in that sense, that's part of what we're seeking to do. We are seeking to pressure through a movement from below. We are seeking to pressure the political establishment, which includes the trade unions, to fight, to intervene to secure the freedom of Assange. If you have such a development, and I'm not aware of it, on the West Coast, where did you say, San Francisco?
Correct, San Francisco Labor Council.
Okay, well, then that is an interesting development, and it reflects the fact that sections of the union apparatus are well aware that the persecution of Julian Assange does not have support among their members and among the broader working class. The unions act...
James, sorry to interrupt. I mean, I was just... sorry, Jez, I was just wondering, do you see a growing labor radicalism at the moment worldwide? I mean, do you think that somehow in the last couple of years there is actually a growing radicalism among labor?
Yes. Yeah, we at the beginning of 2018, in a statement written by the chairman of our international editorial board, David North, I mean, he said 2018 will be characterised by the resurgence of the international class struggle, and that prognosis was completely verified. Right, 2018 witnessed a steady growth. I mean, for example, it was the year of the largest number of strikes in the United States in something like 35 years. And 2019, the first weeks of 2019 have just been marked by a veritable eruption of class struggle around the world, the most significant feature of which, or significant features of which, are three things. One, there is a almost instinctive recognition that the issues that face workers are international, they're not national. Two, that the great issue of politics is social inequality. It's not what colour you are, it's not what gender you are, it's what your class is. Social inequality is the great political divide, the great issue of world politics. And thirdly, and very, very importantly, movements such as the Yellow Vest, developments in France, the eruption on the among the Macuatl, or the workers in Mexico. They're taking place outside of, and in some cases, direct rebellion against the trade unions. I mean, in Mexico, the workers carried a banner: "The company and the unions are killing us." Because I mean, you've got rebellions taking place among teachers across the United States over the appalling conditions that they're forced to work under, and even more shockingly, the conditions of the children that they have to try to teach. Children coming to school who haven't eaten, who can barely clothe themselves. The same issue in Britain, where poverty has never been greater. Now, so the resurgence of what you characterised as labour radicalism, I mean, we're just referring a resurgence of international class struggle. Now, it doesn't have conscious leadership, it doesn't have conscious perspective, and so it can be exhausted. The Yellow Vest movement has been going for, what is it now, 14? Is it 14 weeks? Protest after protest after protest. What's absent is the development of a actually conscious perspective that ordinary people can change the society. They can form their own organisations and move to actually carry through revolutionary social change. Now, it's a massive.
Right, but the hindrance to labor radicalism has historically been obviously fear of unemployment. So how are we going to deal with that problem? Because that's what the capitalists do. I mean, they to deal with labor radicalism, which is, hey, you don't want to work, you're not going to eat. So you've got to somehow deal with that issue. How are we going to conquer the fear of unemployment?
Well, okay, actually the official rates of unemployment are very low, because virtually 50% of the workforce has been transformed into temps, casuals, part-timers, the gig economy. In fact, that's one of the main motivations of the class struggle, the fact that work has become so insecure, so temporary, so people don't know from day to day if they have a job. How do you combat? Right, of course, workers come under the enormous pressure of their day-to-day existence, but it reaches in any political situation, it reaches the point. Leon Trotsky described it very well. The working class can't tolerate the situation it faces, and the ruling class can't rule the way it used to. So we've got two interconnected processes. There's a complete collapse of allegiances and belief in the official establishment, and so they're moving toward dictatorial forms of rule, which the attack on Julian Assange and internet censorship are an aspect. And on the other hand, you have the resurgence of the working class, the vast majority of society, who are coming forward saying, we want a world in which we and our children can not only have a decent living standard, but be free from the danger of a nuclear war and the destruction of humanity through climate change. Now, one of the reasons they hate WikiLeaks and Julian Assange was that Julian Assange was providing the necessary truthful exposures that assist politically equipped ordinary people to fight injustice, to fight social inequality, to fight capitalism. Now, and they, as I think all of us have said in different ways, they're trying to make an example, or they're trying to, by destroying or intimidating, by destroying Julian Assange, hounding him into a corner, silencing Assange, they're seeking to intimidate and silence all critical independent voices. It's the age-old method of state repression. And that's why there must be an international movement, and it's why I hope every person listening in Australia will make their way to Sydney and Melbourne on either March 3 and 10 and demonstrate to fight for his freedom.
You're absolutely right, James, in terms of smearing any legitimate critics of government, of policies. If legitimate criticism is smeared as being an agent of the Kremlin, we saw that during the McCarthy era, during Vietnam, and it's making an unfortunate resurgence right now. We have about 20 minutes left. Kathy Vogan has joined me again. Elizabeth, I wanted to bring you back in because first I wanted to thank you that I've just learned that you very ably took over when I was rudely bumped off of this program because of a technical problem on Kathy's computer, not mine, just want to add. And so thank you again. And I'm going to, if I can, announce that Kathy, Elizabeth, will be going forward to co-host these vigils with me, which is an enormously important news because she can bring a whole different perspective than I can and will make my job a lot easier as well and make it a more interesting program. And if we're ever left with no guests, we can keep it going for a while.
Absolutely.
Instead of go to the music.
Thank you, Joe.
Happened once. So I wanted to ask you about your reporting on Disobedient Media, of which you're the editor-in-chief. More about the issue of, I know it's very complex, and Ray McGovern is usually, Bill we've had on, talk about it in great detail. But it's a little bit more about what James had raised about Guccifer 2. And you've done a lot of really good work on that. Can you just lay that out?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it is very complex. So if I misspeak in any of my discussion of this, that's on me. It's not on, our great technical contributor, Aaron Carter. It's not on the head of an analyst like the Forensicator. But those two individuals have done a huge amount of work, very, thanklessly, basically. We at Disobedient Media have been able to benefit from their analysis. And I have been shocked over time that so few, even independent, media outlets really break down the Guccifer 2 persona and the Guccifer 2 narrative in the way that Adam Carter and the Forensicator really have over the last 2 years. And they've been not only on it from the beginning, but they have continued to produce new analysis that has really enhanced our understanding of the way that persona operated. I don't know that I would be able to summarize each single piece of analysis that they've produced, but basically one of the most underreported or one of the points that really is not understood by the public, even amongst people that have read Disobedient Media articles, in my opinion, is that when CrowdStrike first discussed in articles published by the Washington Post that Guccifer 2 had allegedly breached the DNC and stolen this document, and that he was a Russian hacker and all of that. One of the really big contradictions of that narrative, very simply, is that the document in question in those initial reports came from the Podesta emails, not the DNC itself. So within that first narrative that CrowdStrike put out to the public, you have a massive factual contradiction of that narrative. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up. But I also want to say that moving forward, Disobedient Media will be publishing and discussing more, more analysis by, Adam Carter and the Forensicator. We haven't given up on this subject, although I know that a lot of people may be sick of it and maybe feel like it's old news that's been beaten into the ground. We feel that it's really important to continue to debunk these establishment narratives because no one else will, and because they are used to, increase tensions with a nuclear power. They're used to deflect from the cheating of Bernie Sanders in the DNC in the Democratic primary in 2016. It's used to deflect from every important event and every important issue in the United States and internationally. And as James was mentioning earlier, the Russiagate is used to deflect and to criticize independent media and label us all Kremlin trolls simply because we criticize the establishment and the plutocratic class. And I think that is why it's so important for us collectively as independent media to criticize the Russiagate narrative, no matter how repetitive it may seem to some readers. So
could I ask Elizabeth? I'm just not sure. I've tried to understand the articles by Forensicator, but it's just way above my head. What's the overall thesis that Guccifer 2.0 was that was a setup by CIA or British intelligence? Is that really what the argument is?
Well, I feel that from my understanding of the Forensicator's work, I think that they would be very loath to actually present a thesis because they've been very focused on simply analyzing the data as it exists. And like Ray McGovern says, it is one of the most the cardinal sins of intelligence work is politicizing that data. And I guess taking, that into account, I think that it's difficult to say, that we have proof of one thing or another actually being the explanation for how this persona was created, or the way in which the data they produced was accessed. But what we do have proof about is the fact that this was not a Russian hacker, that Guccifer 2 was a persona, and that the information that they published was not hacked from Russia or from anywhere else. So I think that there are some negations we can definitely put forward, but we don't have enough proof to create a coherent narrative on what did actually happen. I think that Adam Carter has done a fantastic job criticizing CrowdStrike specifically. And I think that in addition to that, Disobedient Media has also reported extensively on the Trump-Russia collusion narrative. And so what we have overall, in terms of a big picture, is an image where you have multiple facets of Russiagate being completely debunkable with publicly available information. And so that to me is the major point. But I agree, Forensicators' work is extremely technical and difficult at times to understand. And so we do our best at Disobedient Media to discuss it in a way that is intelligible to people without a tech background. But it is difficult to understand.
Even without your positive theories, they still smear you, I'm sure, as being a Russian stooge. And I just want to point out, people a lot older than you, Elizabeth, have been criticizing American foreign policy for a long time, way before RT ever existed. Was a glimmer in Vladimir Putin's eye. While the Soviet Union was still in existence, we were doing that. So the way I see it is RT, and they agree with us, or they agree with me. I'm not getting orders. That's the way I see it. Now, I just want one question, because just to clarify, the research is done on metadata that was put out, supposedly Guccifer 2's metadata, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, the NGP van study. Available. Yeah, definitely.
How was that publicly available? Why would that be publicly available? Why would he or whoever he might be do that? And and why would they do that if those clues were in there for someone like the forensicator Adam Carter to come along and decipher that this was a leak and not a hack? If it was a CIA operation, why would they have put that in? Let that information get out?
Well, I believe that the way that the Guccifer 2 published documents on his WordPress blog, and so the metadata that we're talking about is from those documents that he published, and there are multiple different documents at issue that have different traces in them. But what we're talking about when we speak about these Russian fingerprints, we're talking about error messages that were left in a specific document that was Trump opposition research, and that was given to. It was not only published on Guccifer 2's blog, WordPress blog, it was also sent to multiple media outlets, and those media outlets then said, "Oh, look, there are these Russian Cyrillic error messages," and those error messages and that document itself, again, did not come from the DNC emails. It came from John Podesta's emails. It was an attachment from John Podesta. So when we talk about these alleged Russian fingerprints, we're not even talking about a document that came from the DNC. So, debunking the idea that it was a Russian hacker because of the Cyrillic, et cetera, that's not even necessary. All we have to do is identify that this document couldn't have been hacked from the DNC because it didn't come from there. But as far as the error messages themselves, I think that when Guccifer 2 as a persona was created, I think that there was little, I don't think there was much expectation of real pushback, real critical analysis from the establishment media. So I don't think that there was really awareness possibly of the kind of criticism that people like Adam Carter and the Forensicator came up with as a response. I think that the persona was really kind of sloppily made into this Russian, using the name of a Russian intelligence chief as an editor or as an author at one point. Things like that were very hackneyed and very blatant attempts to make this look Russian, I think were intentional because it wasn't Russian. And also, again, I don't think it was done in a way where they were expecting somebody to come in and say, now, look, that's ridiculous, because the establishment basically does control the media narrative. So why would they, expect any pushback?
That's the word I was thinking, sloppy. And had John Kiriakos still been with us, he may have confirmed that there's a lot of sloppy work at the CIA. I want to pass over to Kathy Vogan. She seems to have something to add on this. Kathy?
I certainly do, because I was on with McGovern and William Binney. So there's some new information there. So there is even more up-to-date information that I don't know that Binney has actually released yet. But what he did say 2 vigils ago is that they actually got hold of the well, actually they actually found traces of USB stick formatting in the FAT32 format. So so that was in the
that was actually part of that article that I was talking about earlier. That they published that yesterday, and my mind was blown by that. And
Yes.
you know, we at Disobedient Media will be covering that further. And I think that it's really fascinating the way that they discuss that and interwove it with the debunking of Goose for Two. And so for the listeners, what they were talking about, I believe, if I understood their article correctly, is they were not talking about Goose for Two's and GP van. They weren't talking about Goose for Two metadata. They're talking about the DNC emails and the
all right.
and so that's a big difference, and that's really groundbreaking, because to my knowledge, there has not been a discussion of that FAT32, the indication of a USB being used in the WikiLeaks information. A lot of people did misinterpret our articles about Goose for Two, and they would start saying, "Oh, this means Seth Rich downloaded the information," and we had to say over and over again, we aren't even talking about the information published by WikiLeaks when we're talking about Goose for Two. It's completely separate publications. So yes, that's Binney and Johnson's article was really exciting and groundbreaking.
Well, that's right, and of course, both McGovern and Binney have talked extensively about Marble framework, which, as I think you probably mentioned that I had to take my dog out for a moment, but if I won't repeat it if you've done that already, that they use the Marble to, in fact, create a false digital footprint. So Marble enabled a digital footprint to be left in any of 5 languages. So I believe they were Russian, Korean, Farsi, Chinese, and there was an possibly that was the 5th one. So of course, core of the enemies, of course. Why develop it with those particular languages? But of course, Russia is one of them. So in fact, when in Vault 7, when the Marble framework was revealed in Vault 7, well, there you go. There was, that deniability that this was, evidence that at all that there was any Russian footprint, because it could be faked.
Well, the only problem with that, the only issue there is that when we talk about the Russian error messages, those were error messages within a document, so it wasn't malware, and there's no evidence of a hack in general. There's no evidence of malware in the whole DNC situation. So actually, Marble framework doesn't really apply because there isn't malware involved here. But I absolutely agree with your point that revelation was incredible in terms of even the discussion of Russian hacking, and it really showing how it would be unreliable, even if there had been malware found in that situation, to just assume that it was Russian because it was in Cyrillic or something. So definitely, I agree with your point.
Yes, and then the other main point was also that each element was time-stamped. And in fact, they calculated the time taken to copy each one, and therefore they could calculate the rate of transfer of the information. And they tested every possible fast internet connection in the world to see if they could match that rate of transfer, and it didn't exist anywhere. I think that they could only get to 12 megabits a second. So, and in fact, the rate of transfer of the information corresponded exactly to the rate of transfer to a USB stick, which is absolutely, it
was incredible.
When it's that clear, well, why do they keep just pretending it's not there? That Binney and McGovern, VIPs in general, have been very frustrated over the last year, because that information has been there for a long time, and they have even delivered a copy of their findings to President Trump. So why has it been kept out of the news?
Could I just
I think that go ahead.
Look, I think the forensic
President
dismantling that
any further than that, probably.
Okay, the forensic dismantling of the Russiagate lies is absolutely crucial, and the work that's done by people such as Elizabeth and other journalists is crucial. But what it just underscores is that this is entirely a fix-up. It was, you know, the allegations about Russian interference in the 2016 election was brought forward for a definite political agenda. One, it was certainly used by the Democratic Party to try to apologise for or justify the defeat of their right-wing militarist warmongering candidate, Hillary Clinton, who, even though she got, you know, actually she got more than 3.5 million more votes than Trump, but the American political system is so decrepit, so degenerated, that barely half the population vote, and Trump scraped into office through the provinces of the Electoral College. You know, WikiLeaks had nothing to do with Donald Trump getting elected. The Democratic Party did, and American capitalism did, because people are so disgusted with the state of society that they view the entire setup with hatred, and they don't vote. Now, then the whole issue was elevated because you've got a conflict. I mean, this is something that we've tried to probe quite clearly and explain. I mean, you've got a tactical conflict in the American establishment. They all agree that they're going to go to war with China, right? But there's a debate over whether or not you need to take out Russia first so that Russia can't be an ally of China in a confrontation, or whether you just concentrate on China. Now, the Democratic Party, the military intelligence apparatus, the CIA and so on, want to take out Putin and Russia first. That's what this is about. Then they will devote everything against China, which is the main policy being pursued by Trump with his trade war. It's currently, the trade talks just finished today. They've ended in a complete shambles. America is spearing toward confrontation. So anyway, I know we're about to wind up, but just to give make a final appeal. Hopefully I may get an opportunity to speak on the vigil again before March 3. But if I don't, make an appeal to everyone in Australia to attend those rallies, and I really appeal to the broader WikiLeaks community to give the maximum support to this endeavour that our party and John Pilger and others are making. Thanks.
James, you're welcome back anytime to the vigil. We may not give you as much time next time, but we want you here because you've made an enormous contribution today. We have 5 minutes left. I just want to say, yes, the people are fed up with the state of society because they live in a society of the state, owned by the state. So, Kathy, if you can ask a question of James in under 3 minutes, I'll let you do it. Okay, you've just promised that. Then I'm closing out the
James, I just, when you were talking about the agenda against Russia, the plan, well, of course, we've discovered that the Integrity Initiative's plan is pro-war against Russia as well. Do you think there's any link between those mobs? That's my question.
This is the issue in Britain, the Integrity Initiative. Yes, I mean, look, it's not just, obviously this agenda is not just underway in the United States. I mean, it's the central political issue in every imperialist country in Europe. I mean, the Munich summit is underway at the moment, where the whole discussion is about, the one that they just had in Poland, the whole discussion was about preparing a war in Iran. And now you've got the summit in Munich, where the European Union is discussing, well, to be blunt, what they're discussing is at a certain point they're gearing up to go to war with the United States. Now Britain, the British capitalist class, are lining up with the United States. There's a faction, but the anti-Russia business in Britain is very acute. I mean, just to take I don't know if anyone noticed, but yesterday in Australia, the executives of Google and Facebook were holding top-level meetings with government officials to discuss so-called fake news and foreign interference in the upcoming Australian election. And I don't need to tell you who the suspects are. One, Russia, but two, above all, China. Australia is descending into just an anti-China xenophobic witch hunt where opposition to Australia's alliance with the United States is just denounced as foreign interference by China. So this is a universal process, and it's just to keep coming back. I mean, the strand connecting the defense of Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, and independent media, the strand that connects into the broader issues is that they're attacking Assange and WikiLeaks as part of an agenda toward ever greater social inequality and a drive toward war, and they want to silence dissent. And that's why Assange must be defended.
That's an excellent last word, James. It almost sounds amateurish that they're exporting from the U.S. to Australia this notion of foreign interference, and it seems to be working.
They're actually, sorry? The American Congress hailed Australia as an example for the attack on China. Australia has passed what's called the foreign interference laws, the most draconian laws in the world against so-called foreign.
We're the first of the Five Eyes because we're the weakest.
Yeah, so pretty sad. I want to end the program now. We usually end on a very depressing note, so we're doing that again. I wanted to thank our guest.
Why don't we end on a note that we're going to fight and we're going to organize and unify and mobilize?
Oh, now we're ending on a positive, optimistic note. Thank you.
There you go.
For that, James.
Great.
Thank you very much for that. I need to thank a bunch of people that I wrote down on the list, which I cannot find. I want to thank, hopefully I can remember everyone, Garland Nixon, who joined us wearing his yellow vest from Washington, D.C. John Kiriakou, also in Washington, wearing a normal Pittsburgh Pirates jersey. George Samueli, I think coming from New York City.
That's right.
James Cogan right here in Sydney, Australia. Elizabeth Voss from Little Rock. Is that where you are?
I'm actually in Fayetteville, Arkansas, but close enough. Same state.
Same difference. Same. Okay, well, we won't go into that. And appearing again in the last 20 minutes is Ann Garrison in the Bay Area. And unfortunately, we're not able to bring her in.
I was actually here for half an hour. And let me just say that one reason I didn't get in earlier was because so many of the previous guests were so interesting. This is probably the most informative Unity for Jay I've seen, and I will probably clip some of it tomorrow and put it on the radio news.
And maybe next time you come in earlier so you can contribute. So I want to also thank the audience for tuning in to watch us.
It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon out here.
We have no excuse.
No
excuse. At 8 a.m. over here. People in Europe are going past midnight. You've got the best time slot. And okay. I want to thank also the technical support here, Joe Booth and Kitty. And of course, Kathy Vogan here for sharing her computer and her apartment. And while we were offline, a lunch and a coffee. So I want to say goodbye and urge everyone to join us again. Yes, Kathy's friend Claire is the one who actually produced the lunch. Excuse me for that. So Claire, thank you. Visiting from Adelaide for the event Thursday night. So just again, next Friday for the 18th edition of the Vigil for Julian Assange. And I say goodbye to everyone and thank you again.
Arrivederci.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
See, how do I get out of this?